the question posted right on the top. So, 19th century English novelist Charles Dickens opens his novel Hard Times with a description of the central character, Mr. Gradgrind. Even before his rather appropriate name is revealed, Dickens makes sure the reader understands what Mr. Gradgrind is like. Discuss the direct and indirect methods used to characterize him in the following passage. All right. So, who would like to read aloud for us?
So should I?
Okay, you can go ahead reading, and while you read, uh, all of us would look for answer to this question. What is the direct and indirect method used to characterize the character of Gradgrind in the novel? So, students, you have to respond to this question towards the end of this reading. Where does Dickens use direct method and where does he use indirect method in order to introduce the character of Gradgrind? All right, please begin the reading.
Uh, Now what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be. Sir, can you please zoom it a little bit? Okay. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. The scene was a plain, bare, monotonous vault of a schoolroom, and the speaker's square forefinger emphasized his observations by underscoring every sentence with a line on the schoolmaster's sleeve. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's square wall of a forehead, which had his eyebrows uh, for its base, while his eyes found commodious cellarage in two dark caves, overshadowed by the wall. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's mouth, which was wide, thin, and hard set. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's voice, which was inflexible, dry, and dictatorial. The emphasis was helped by the speaker's hair, which bristled on the skirts of his bald head, a plantation of furs to keep the wind from its shining surface, all covered with knobs, like the crust of a plum pie, as if the head had scarcely warehouse room for the hard facts stored inside. The speaker's obstinate carriage, square coat, square legs, square shoulders, nay, his very neckcloth strained to take him by the throat with an unaccommodating grasp, like a stubborn fact as it was, all helped the emphasis. In this life, we want nothing but facts, sir, nothing but facts. The speaker and the schoolmaster and the third grown person present all backed a little and swept with their eyes the inclined plane of little vessels, then and there arranged in order, ready to have imperial gallons of facts poured into them until they were full to the brim.
Okay, thank you. So, just let's see just this, this part of the extract. So, can you first point out, anybody in the class point out the uh, indirect method of introducing the character? Where do you find the indirect method over here?
Sir, the
Sir, in the
indirect method is
paragraph,
in the first paragraph.
paragraph in the last, second last.
Okay, so where do you find the direct method and where is it that it is indirect? Okay, let me hold on. I just need to, because otherwise you all will speak together. So you can raise hands, whosoever wants to respond, and then I can let you know. Okay, Varisha, go ahead. And
Sir, the first paragraph in which the person in the novel is speaking. Now, what I want is facts. The whole paragraph in which he spoke, it's indirect characterization because the writer has portrayed his personality by what he speaks or what he does. So yeah, that's indirect characterization.
Okay, right. So Sayyid Haider Shah, you was the other person. Aisha Latif, go ahead.
Sir, in the second paragraph and in the last paragraph, where writers speak about directly about the characterization.
All right. And that is what, which characterization? So what kind of characterization will be that? Starting from second paragraph?
Sir, it's direct characterization.
All right. Okay. So Halima, you want to comment?
Uh, Even though the description of his face is direct categorization, but the fact that the author has highlighted that every feature of Mr. Gradgrind was square, this is indirect categorization to his personality, that he was too pragmatic and too boring. He was a square personality.
Yeah, yeah, and that is very effective at the same time because it reinforces what we find in the author's own speech. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Other comments? So do you see the similarity between the descriptions of the character through direct and indirect methods, or do you see any dissimilarity? So you can always refer to the primary, definition of direct and indirect method of characterization over here that we covered in the last class. This one, right? So authors can reveal character directly or indirectly. Direct characterization is when a narrator, okay, explicitly describes the background, motivation, temperament, or appearance of a character, right? So in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, for instance, we are told directly that Mrs. Bennet was a woman of mean understanding. Okay, so indirect characterization, on the other hand, is when an author shows, like in the first paragraph of the extract that we read today. All right, any student has any question or doesn't get this point? So direct characterization is where the author is directly speaking to us, while indirect is where we infer from the dialogues of the character. Okay, if there is no question, I assume that you get this point. Okay, uh, over here. Okay, so let's read about the setting now. Okay, now of course, characterization was just one component in the art of fiction. So you might remember that we started from the plot structure, and we discussed that with reference to Talha. You need to mute your mic, please. So we start from the structure of the plot that we discussed with reference to Maki's short story. and then we moved on to characterization, which is another feature in fiction. So basically, when you read and analyze fiction, you look for its plot, you look for the characterization, and you also look for the setting, right? Now, setting in a short story or in a novel or in prose fiction, generally speaking, is the physical description of the scene where the action takes place. So over here, we are introduced to setting in a passage from Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. Over here, Poe describes the castle where Prince Prospero and his friends seclude themselves in an attempt to escape the plague that is threatening the community. Notice how the physical details of the description create a sinister and foreboding atmosphere. And now this is very important, that the setting is not there just for the sake of it. Rather, the setting reinforces the atmosphere that is created by the dialogues, or that is created by the action. So there might be sinister setting, there might be pleasant setting, depending on a particular context. So let's read the setting in this particular short story, just to make sense of how the setting works over here. So this is a short story, The Mask of the Red Death. Okay, so when a text is written in inverted commas, it is a short story. When it is written in italics, it is a novel. Okay, so now we need a reader to read this extract from Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of Red Death. And those who might not have heard about Edgar Allan Poe, he is one of the major uh, American short story writers. Okay, so any reader to read this extract?
So I can read.
Please go ahead. And we are trying to understand the setting now. Go ahead, please.
Okay, sir. It was a voluptuous scene that masquerade, but first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were seven, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so regularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. That was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards. At each turn, a novel effect. To the to the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The, s- the second chamber was purple in its ornaments and taped stars, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet, the seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue, but in this chamber only the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in one of the seven apartments, was there any lamp and or candelabrum? Amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood tinted panes were ghastly in the extreme, and the dark hanging and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzer perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced three which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulous and meditation as before.
Okay, thank you. So you might have noticed that it is very well detailed uh, setting. Okay, and I hope you agree based upon this reading that this is nothing but setting. Okay, so in this whole extract, no action takes place, no characterization, no dialogue. Dialogue means conversation between characters. So you might remember from the story by Markey, about the dentist that we read. There, right from the beginning, there was conversation between the son and the dentist, right? Then there was also kind of implied conversation between the dentist and the mayor, right? But over here, you must have noticed it in this part that we read, there is no conversation yet. Okay. Similarly, in the extract from Pride and Prejudice that we read, there was a constant conversation among the characters. Okay. Again, in this extract, there is no conversation, right? So, depending upon the style of the writer, the way that setting is described varies. Okay, Alan Poe is famous for uh, scary settings or for the settings full of suspense. So there is another, famous short story by him called "The Killers." So there is very little that happens throughout the story, but the setting is so overwhelming and effective. And then there are other stories by Poe as well, which have the similar kind of effect on the reader. Okay, so as we were, uh, so, as I was making the point right in the beginning, that the setting has a kind of functional role, right? It is not there just for cosmetic purpose. It's not that the writer wants to make his story beautiful or her story beautiful. Rather, it is to convey a certain effect on the mind of the reader. Now, from the dentist story, you might remember that from the setting of the clinic, we were able to make an estimate about or an assessment about the the quality of the life that that the dentist was spending. Okay, there was no direct, you know, introduction of the class to which the dentist belonged. Yet the setting could convey that to us. In this case, the setting that we just came across in Edgar Allan Poe, uh, can you figure out at least a few of highlights in the setting? I mean, the effect we already know because this is what we have been told, that it is a sinister effect. It is a foreboding atmosphere. It is an atmosphere of looming danger, right? But can you describe a few highlights in this whole setting? Yes, students. What is the general impression you have of this setting? Anything that impressed itself upon your mind? Yeah, just one word response would be enough. Just one word. What is that impressed itself on your mind from the whole reading?
Sir, it's
Sir, the setting is very.
Okay, hold on. So Halima's comment is in writing. It is Gothic. Uh, Now, who was speaking? The first person, please go ahead.
yes, sir. Sir, it's to describe all the physical things which were there.
Okay, no, of course. That actually means that setting is the physical context. It is supposed to be physical context. So from that perspective, you are absolutely right. I want you to just be a little more specific. What in the physical setting which impressed itself on your mind? Um, so Rija says extravagant, and I think by that she means that the description is too rich and it is too saturated, which I think is true. Uh, Arisha says it evokes an element of supernatural. Okay, yeah, that and that is connected with Halima's point of Gothic, because Gothic and supernatural, they are very close to each other. So who I think somebody told me they had read Wuthering Heights.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you might recall from the novel Wuthering Heights. I mean, that is something that might evade your critical view in the beginning, but you might have noticed that as well. That the setting of, I mean, the story is there, right? But other than the story, the setting of the novel is very, very saturated. So there is the the scenic description and the description of the the garden, the drawing rooms, the landscape, that is so overwhelming, and that simply captures you, or captures your imagination. Uh, that is why the novel Wuthering Heights is also called one of the Gothic, a novel in Gothic tradition. So Varisha says it is kind of eccentric and odd. I would say is eccentric in the sense that it does not follow the regular uh, pattern, of a building as a normal building would be. So from that perspective, it is a little abnormal, and I think that impression is kind of understandable. The impression that this description is eccentric and odd, it is totally understandable because the the author intends to make this setting a little eccentric or abnormal. So all these words, supernatural, abnormal, eccentric, gothic, they kind of speak, or sinister for that matter, they all speak to each other, right? So in terms of the in terms of the highlights within the story, I was also thinking about the color effect. Okay, the the writer is constantly obsessed with creating effects through colors. So for one particular room that he wants to pay special attention to has the blood red color, and I think you can imagine what effect it might have on one's imagination. And then that color effect is supported by a sonic effect, right? Where does the sonic effect come from? It comes from a huge clock, right? And you might have noticed how much the writer has spent his time on just describing just describing the one chime, one ring that comes out of the clock, starting from here until here. So this is all about, one chime that comes out of the clock. So when the hour strikes, one can listen to the bell coming out of the clock, right? And in this description, the impression that we get is that it is a kind of old times clock, which probably has been there for centuries. You know, look at this expression, brazen lungs of clock, right? So it's not a new clock, rather, it's really old one. Now, the sonic effect, therefore, is from a clock that really seems to be of olden times. Now, these things together, the color effect and the sonic effect, both of them together, they create an impression or an atmosphere or a feeling of something which is really archaic, which is centuries old, probably an apartment building which has never been opened for hundreds of years. Okay. So Maheen over says moody and grim. I would just stick to the second word, grim, right? So there is certain grimness in whole description, an extraordinary seriousness, you know, uh, a kind of seriousness which borders to fear, actually, right? So that the description kind of, arouses fear at the same time, fear of something which is not very pleasant. Okay, rather opposite of that. So you might have noticed the role of description. So when you are analyzing a literary text, which is a fiction, piece of fiction, in addition to the plot and characterization, you pay special attention to the description as well. You might describe in your own words what the description looks like, and you can discuss what is its impact or possible impact on the reader, and then finally how it contributes to the overall atmosphere or overall themes of the story or of the um, literary text. Okay, Now we come to another feature in a literary text. It is called historical context. Okay. So prose fiction, or fiction for that matter, is very often situated in a particular historical era. It's very common practice with almost every other novel that you pick up. Okay. Now, this example is from John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Okay. And as we read through this extract, we will realize that there is a lot of information that we can understand only through historical context. Anybody would like to read this extract from here, please? Reader for this extract, please. Anybody would like to read this part? Okay, so Aisha, you can read.
Sir, do we have to read it from Highway 66?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
Yes.
Okay, I'll read it. Highway 66 is the main migrant road. 66, the long concrete path across the country, waving gently up and down on the map, from Mississippi to Bakersfield, over the red lands and the gray lands, twisting up into the mountains, crossing the divide, and down into the bright and terrible desert, and across the desert to the mountains again, and into the rich California valleys. Should I continue?
Yes, please read till the end. Yeah.
Okay. 66 is the path of a people in flight, refugees from dust and shrinking land, from the thunder of tractors and shrinking ownership, from the desert's slow northward invasion, from the twisting winds that howl up out of Texas, from the floods that bring no richness to the land and steal what little richness is there. From all of these, the people are in flight, and they come into 66 from the tributary side roads, from the wagon tracks and the rutted country roads. 66 is the mother road, the road of flight. Clarksville and Ozark and Van Buren and Fort Smith on 64. And there's an end of Arkansas.
Arkansas.
Sorry. And all the roads in Oklahoma City, 66 down from Tulsa, McLeod, Purcell, 66 out of Oklahoma City, El Reno, and Clinton, going west on 66, Hydro, Elk City, and Texola. And there's an end to Oklahoma, 66 across the panhandle of Texas, Shamrock and McLean, Conway and Amarillo, the Yellow, Wildorado, and Vega, and Boys, and there's an end of Texas. Say, I don't know how to pronounce this word.
Tucumcari.
Tucumcari and Santa Rosa, and into the New Mexican mountains to Albuquerque.
Albuquerque. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Where
Albuquerque.
the road comes down from Santa Fe, then down the gorged Rio Grande to Los Lunas, and west again on 66 to Gallup. And there's the border of New Mexico.
Okay. Now the only point, this I would say this is a little more saturated with the historical references, but the point of this example is it's very common in a literary text for the writer to include the actual historical allusions and the actual geographical landscape. Okay, and this kind of these kind of historical allusions or geographical allusions, yet they sometimes pose a challenge to the reader in this manner that you might have to consult the actual historical or uh, geographical records or historical and geographical information in order to totally understand what the writer is talking about. Okay, now not every text would have it in it, but many texts will have this kind of description in it. Sometimes we just take that description for granted. Okay, now for example, if you think of Wuthering Heights, even if that seems to be such a ahistorical kind of text, where you have more of a romantic story going on with all that supernatural uh, uh, setting, yet the description of the buildings and the description of the marshes, you know, is very typical of the actual geography of the countryside in England. Okay, so that way there are geographical and historical contexts to that novel too. But some novels are little more prone to the historical description, just like the one that you just read about just now. All right. Charles Dickens' novels are also famous for historical allusions. Uh, Not exactly from the perspective of the landscape, but definitely from the perspective of the social themes. Okay, so sometimes when we use the expression social theme, it kind of undermines the specificity, uh, the historical specificity which is there in Charles Dickens' text. So, lot many themes in Charles Dickens novels, they are lot many themes have detailed historical research available out there, and if you wish to explore any, you actually have to explore some of the historical records to understand what those themes mean, right? For example, child labor, okay, or poverty, uh, or corruption, you know, or jail culture in 18th century England, right? So we cannot generally make a sweeping statement that Dickens novels were about the bad conditions in British jails of 18th century. Rather, if you really wish to work on that, you actually will have to look for some historical books in order to understand what that culture looked like, and then how Dickens' representation of that matches with it or is different from what is in the historical records. Okay, so sometimes the context in the novel is not that of history, but it is that of culture. That is, certain cultures are introduced in the novel or in a short story. An example of that is George Orwell's 1984. This is a very interesting read. Those who have not read it yet, I would suggest them to put it on their reading list. It's very easily available in all libraries. You might have its version online as well. Uh, but it's a very interesting book to read for you. Now, there is a very strong cultural, environment in the novel uh, in terms of how certain political structures impact the cultures of different societies. Over here, in specific, how totalitarianism, you know, changes the culture of a particular society, how totalitarianism affects human relationships and family system and freedom in a particular society. And George Orwell wrote about that at the time when people were not yet talking much about the after effects of totalitarian culture in a society. Okay, so this was the time when different isms were still taking grip of the world, and people had started talking about that. So let's read this as a last extract for today for historical context. Okay, so who would like to read George Orwell's 1984? So somebody else had raised hand previously. That is no more there now, but anybody else who would like to read? There's no reader in the class.
Sir, I'll read it again.
Okay, go ahead, please.
It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13.
So did
Winston
you,
Smith.
yeah, so you might have noticed right from the first line, right? And the clocks were striking 13. Okay, so it is about the cultural environment. Okay, and as we already gave you a hint, it is about how dictatorships and totalitarianisms, how they change certain cultures. Okay, so this novel is about how uh, certain dictators change the reality for the people living in a particular society. So while historically speaking, we never believed in a clock striking 13, right? Because the clock stops at 12, right? But if you are talking about a society which is heavily influenced by a totalitarian ruler or by a dictator, she or he, well, historically, it has always been he, so we can use the word he as well, pronoun he as well. So a dictatorial ruler or a totalitarian ruler actually make the people believe that there are 13 hours right in a clock rather than 12. So it is like how they manipulate the reality and how they manipulate the minds of people to think about the reality the way the rulers think about it. Okay, not as the objective reality, but the reality as the rulers think about it to be. So they make the people believe into the reality which rulers think is reality, right? Not any scientific or objective reality. So please go on.
Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast into an effort to escape the wild wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tagged to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide. The face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so
contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you. The caption beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, would be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, pale figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even though the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals, and though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own.
Okay, yeah, this is enough. Thank you. So, so you can read through and realize how the cultural context is being introduced to us, right? How people are interacting with each other, living in a society, and how they are responding to a certain poster, right? Big Brother is watching you, which in fact is the depiction of the all-powerful ruler. Okay, you can think of any dictatorial ruler in any nation across the world at this time to understand how it works, right? So the big poster of posters of many of the uh, ruling dictators, well, not exactly dictators, they could be kind of democratically elected dictators as well, right? But then how they make sure that they know everything what is that is happening under their eyes, right? So the poster, in fact, is a representation of those kind of rulers, right, who continue to watch what is happening in their society, and not only they watch it, they totally control it as well, right? Okay,